This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture. And welcome back to the City of God podcast, where we are weekly talking about today's biggest cultural issues, all through the lens of God's infallible word. My name's Pacienza, and today I'm joined by my very good friend, Pastor Sam Kastensmidt. He's a good friend, good partner of our ministry, both at Coral Ridge Ministries and the Institute for Faith and Culture. He is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church in America and is the pastor of Christian education at Rio Vista Community Church in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Sam, great to have you back.
It's good to be here.
God.
Good to be here.
So, Sam, we're going to talk about a number of things today, and mostly I want to talk about the influence of Christianity in the West, and all of the ways in which it's shaped culture, all the ways it's influenced culture, because I think this is a timely conversation for a number of reasons. One, we see what institutions of higher education are trying to do to rewrite the history books, to somehow build this narrative that Christianity was not influential in a positive way, but it was oppressive. It was somehow led to great atrocities throughout human history. And we need to do everything possible to liberate ourselves from the shackles of the influence of Christianity on the West, and particularly here in America. I think it's also timely because we're heading into the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And we'll dive into how Christianity and the Judeo-Christian worldview shaped the founding documents of our nation. But let's start broader for the conversation today. Let's just talk to our audience about how Christianity was foundational, the values that came out of the Christian worldview, and how it shaped Western civilization.
Yeah, if you go back to the beginning of Christianity, it radically reshaped the world as it spread. And so you had things, Roman ethics, Greek ethics that came out of Stoicism and things like that. The cardinal virtues were there. But things like humility and mercy, they were seen as weaknesses. There was no sense of covenantal love or marriage or virtue and sexuality. So if you lived back in the days of Jesus, like I think I would have been a card-carrying Pharisee. Because if you looked at what Israel held dear because of their Old Testament values, the things that were handed down from Moses, they held things to be sacred. But if you looked outside into the Roman world, there were things that were commonplace. I mean, if you went to Corinth, the way that you worshiped the goddess Aphrodite, that was the matron goddess of that city, was by going to a temple and engaging in cult prostitution. And you found that throughout the world. Child sacrifice was prevalent everywhere. And the Celtics would put men, women, and children in wicker creations and burn them alive. In Carthage, Plutarch writes about how when he went down there, that he came across the poor, and they were literally selling their own children to be sacrifices of the rich under the condition that they weren't allowed to cry or shed a tear or even moan when their children were being slaughtered, or they would lose the money that they gained from that. You look at the sexual ethics, you look at the ethics of life, you look at the rights that were given to the poor, to the women, to the marginalized. Everything about the ancient culture was radically transformed when Christianity began to spread and take root all throughout the world. And there's a lot today that we look back and, a lot of times the enemies of Christianity borrow ethics from Christianity. Like if you removed Christianity and you went back to the ethics that existed before Christianity, they would be very, very grateful for the transformation that Christianity has made that's given them the very right to question it.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you mentioned the Greco-Roman culture. I mean, certainly the values that we're going to talk about today in this podcast that came about in the first few centuries certainly could not be attributed to Greco-Roman culture or a Greco-Roman worldview, but an explicitly Christian worldview with this new ethic of the kingdom that it brings to society. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about one value in particular, the value of the sanctity of human life. Mm-hmm. How did Christianity coming onto the scene in the first century bring a whole new dimension to the thought of the sacredness of human life?
So if you were to jump in a time machine again and go back there, you would find a population imbalance between boys and girls, men and women, in the Roman Empire. Rodney Stark has gone back and done some demographic studies, and what you find is because everybody preferred to have a boy, when they would have a girl, oftentimes they would practice what was called exposure in the ancient world, where you have a baby and it's like, oh, I didn't want a girl, so you leave it out to the elements, you leave it out to creatures to come and kill the baby. And you found that practice all throughout the Roman world, to where I think in Rome it was 130 males for every 100 females. And so there was a great population imbalance because boys were to be preferred. And if you had a female baby, just get rid of it. In fact, we have a letter written on papyrus of a soldier who's writing from Alexandria, who writes to his wife saying, please don't worry about me cheating on you. And by the way, I know you're pregnant. If you have a boy, keep it. If you have a girl, discard it. We have it in writing. It's chilling that was absolutely commonplace in the ancient world. And this isn't just a Roman and Greek thing. When the first missionaries, William Carey, when he went to India looking at in the 1800s, he found that they were throwing children in the Ganges River as an offer of worship. But when Christian ethics through British colonization came, it put an end to it. You go to the Aztecs when they landed there, and they were practicing child sacrifice, and it came to an end. You go down into Peru, there was child sacrifice, and it came to an end. You go to the Celtic civilization, Northern Africa, all throughout the regions, everywhere that Christianity would ultimately land on the shores, they would find these reprehensible behaviors where children were being sacrificed, and the introduction of Western Christian values put an end to it. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I find frightening is as our civilization walks away from Christianity, as our civilization says, you know what, maybe Christian ethics aren't for us, let's go back to, just materialist ethics. Mm-hmm. What do we find? The return of those things. We find a return to where there's since 1973, if you look around the world, up to 2.9 billion abortions since 1973. It's mind-numbing. But that ethic, as Christianity wanes in Western civilization and Western cultures, you see that is surging back again.
Yeah, and it's logical, Sam, correct? I mean, if the value and the dignity of life is defined by what you do and what you can accomplish, then certainly it becomes so subjective as far as who gets to live and who gets to thrive and who gets to prosper and who doesn't. But if it's true that all human beings are created in the image of God, the doctrine of the Imago Dei, we realize that value, dignity, and sacredness are something that is inherent. Yeah. Your value is not based on what you do. It's based on who you are. And that truly revolutionized the world in the first century.
Absolutely. And we look at those ancient cultures and we say they're primitive because they're sacrificing their children to gods made of bronze or gold or whatever. But you look at what's going on today, we're still sacrificing our children to our gods, of career or money or convenience or all self.
Sure.
You see that. But when all people are made in the image of God, that radically changes the way you see the value of life. Yeah. It radically changes the way you see marriage. It radically changes the way you see the dignity of women in the ancient world. Because if you want to go down that rabbit hole, that's another one that's radically different.
But I appreciate I don't want to lose that point, because we do look at the ancient civilizations and go, I can't believe how barbaric they were. Mm-hmm. No, you had state-sponsored child sacrifice then. You have state-sponsored child sacrifice today. Planned Parenthood still, I hope by the time this episode rolls out that President Trump removes all federal funding from Planned Parenthood. But as of today, at the time of this recording, we still have state-sponsored child sacrifice. Nothing new under the sun.
That's right. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars given to Planned Parenthood for that purpose. You have states that include taxpayer-funded abortions in their Medicaid programs. I mean, so it is exactly what you've said, state-sponsored infanticide.
Yeah. So image of God, Christian worldview, the leaven of society, all of a sudden children have rights, children have dignity. We see the end of infanticide. But you mentioned the value of women. And I think it's ironic, the attack of Christianity in our modern culture that, that women in particular have to break free from the shackles of traditional Christianity and, that it's an oppressive religion and it holds women back. And if they truly want to be who they were meant to be, that they somehow have to be liberated from the traditional values of American society and so on and so forth. So talk about what Christianity did for the role of the woman.
Well, the role of the woman was elevated tremendously because of the gospel. Like if you went to different cultures, including the culture of Israel, including all over the Roman Empire, what you would find is that women were treated essentially as second-class citizens. They had no legal rights. In a lot of cultures, they didn't have a right to testify. They had no inheritance rights. If you went back and you looked at the laws that were instituted under Emperor Augustus toward women, like they were pretty harsh. You did not have a lot of rights apart from your husband or a father. And so when Christianity came about, like there is so much in the Bible that elevates women and gives them dignity. And, you have Paul writing, there's neither male nor female, but all one in Christ, equal heirs of the promise. And so when Christianity started spreading, one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating, and it goes back to looking at demographics, that the groups that it spread the fastest with were women. Like women flocked to Christianity. And you have to ask yourself, why would that be? Because it's a worldview that says you're made in the image of God, that God comes and sees you and values you. Every other culture during that time period looked at you as just a utilitarian thing. You look at what some of the ancients wrote about women, that they're beasts, that they shouldn't have their own thoughts. And we're talking about guys like Aristotle saying that. That very, very harsh statements toward women. And when Christianity comes along, it's like, no, they're to be elevated and protected. You're not allowed to just divorce your wife and leave her without rights and walk away for her for nilly-willy reasons. Like everything is made valuable and rich, and women flocked to the church. Yeah. Slaves flocked to the church. You look at all the demographics. It's the marginalized that fled, and it was the wealthy Roman elite that came slow.
Sure.
But it was those marginalized groups that came, which says, hey, you've got an emperor over here that's exploiting everybody. The emperors that came about in the first century were atrocious men. And then you have a king that was willing to die for you. They're looking to the slaves and saying, this is a God who became a slave, a servant for you, to give his infinite inheritance to you. This is a God who comes and exalts women and treasures them, and the first witness of the resurrection. And you think of Mary and Martha and so many of the people written in Paul's epistles, like they were given roles in the early church that were powerful and profound.
Christianity is the furthest thing from being oppressive. It was the very thing that liberated the marginalized.
That's right.
It gave freedom and flourishing to those that were considered outcasts in a society and a culture, where you had to be a particular status, a particular gender to have any rights, to have a voice in a court of law, for instance. And here comes Christ and this incredible revolutionary movement that really did change the world.
And the challenge to somebody who says, oh, yeah, right. Like, okay, well, let's take modern day. Let's look at the nations that have been touched by the gospel and Western civilization. And what do you find there? You find women's rights. You find dignity given to women. They have a voice. They can drive. They can read. They can learn. They can do all these things that we take for granted today. Go elsewhere in the world and see how that works out. Go to Islamic countries and see what they look like. Go to Far Eastern countries. Right. Radically different story. It's in the countries where Christianity has influenced their history that women are treated with dignity.
Yeah. It's so funny you mentioned that. It's baffling to me when you take a group, for instance, like the Squad, who represent, for all the wrong reasons, the modern feminist movement in America, if not the West, and how pro-Palestine they are, and how anti-Christian they are, and certainly anti-Israel they are. And I'm going, do you even understand consistently what you're fighting for and what you're advocating for? I mean, if you all were to go over there, you'd be stoned to death for being so vocal and for being so flamboyant and so flippant about your political positions.
It's ideologically suicidal.
Yeah.
And there's so many positions of the modern left that are like that. I mean, when you think about God, I teach this to students, but When you think of God, one of his chief attributes is life. Like he just, life overcomes darkness. From the beginning, it's life triumphing over darkness. It's light triumphing over darkness, life triumphing over death and barrenness and all the stories of the Old Testament. And when you look at the agenda that the left puts forward, so much of it yields barrenness and a loss of life. I mean, from abortion, which is obvious on its face, it's killing the next generation, to feminism, which, this is a hot button thing, but it says, I'm going to put off family to pursue career. And then oftentimes it's too late and it's at the sacrifice of the next generations. The LGBTQ movement, which is on its face not producing life, transgenderism and those surgeries that are irreversible that ultimately keep life from flourishing. There's so much about the things that they rally around that ultimately prevents flourishing and fertility in life. And on its face, that's not what God is about.
No, sir. So let's talk about another issue, and that's the issue of human flourishing. It's not opinion, but it is fact. Wherever, and you mentioned it briefly earlier, wherever the Christian worldview has been embraced, not just have Christians flourished, but the entire society has flourished. I can't remember the emperor, but he laments over the Galileans, who are not only serving their own poor. Was it Julian? Yeah, not only serving their own poor, but serving our poor as well. And it was mind blowing. It was baffling. These Galileans, who were the early followers of Christ, of course, bring to the scene this whole new ethic that not only were honoring children and widows and women, but they were serving people outside of the camp, people who weren't like themselves. And we see down the road the establishment of the hospital that wasn't just for Christians, but for all people of all faiths. So talk about the human flourishing and shalom that came about for all people wherever the Christian worldview was embraced.
Yeah, well, going back to what we talked about at the beginning with infanticide, it was the work of guys like Origen that would push against the emperor, saying this needs to stop. And ultimately, when Theodosius comes along, Emperor Theodosius in the 4th century AD, like laws start passing that says we are not going to allow infanticide or exposure anymore. That's coming to an end. And it was met with severe penalties. And then Justinian comes along and he expands it to where he says we're not only not going to do exposure, but you have a duty as a citizen of Rome that if you find an abandoned baby, you are to adopt that baby just as we have been adopted into the kingdom of grace.
Wow.
So this ethic goes from just kind of a distant, stoic, cardinal virtue, no mercy, no humility ideal, to where now the law comes with a sense of compassion and beauty and a care for people. And it's not just the elite and the upper echelon that gets the benefits of the law, but it cares for all of society. And that begins to build. And you see that carry out through so much of what the church does. Even down, I find it ironic that probably the biggest enemies of the church today that tear it down all the time are coming out of the educational elites, right?
Yeah.
But if you go back, to your point, wherever Christianity spreads, that's what you find. Flourishing comes. The university system, where did that come from?
Sure.
The first universities were begun by the church, the University of Bologna, the Paris, Oxford, all of these great institutions that came around, and we call that the scholastic age, right?
Yep.
If you went back to the 1st century at Jesus' time in the Roman Empire, the greatest empire the world had ever seen to that point, literacy rates were below 10%. By the time you get to the scholastic age, it's still underneath 20%. Then you have the invention of the printing press with Gutenberg. It doesn't impact literacy rates that much. You know what sends literacy rates soaring? The Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation comes along, and there's this emphasis that, hey, we are a universal priesthood. It's not just you receiving from on high what somebody else's opinion of God's word is. You should read it for yourself. You have access to the throne room of God. You should hear his truth for yourself. And all of a sudden, everybody starts getting the word for themselves. There's a reason why the first Bibles printed, or first books printed from Gutenberg, or Bibles. And what do you see in the generation, in the century after the Protestant Reformation? Like the Dutch literacy rate goes from 12% to 53% in a century. And it's all the Protestant nations. The Catholics lag behind, actually, because they don't have the universal priesthood of believers. And in all these denominations, all these nations with Protestant denominations, literacy soars and education begins to just run rampant. And you find that all over the world. I mean, you can name a human rights cause and the church is at the forefront. When it's introduced to a culture, you find flourishing. And when it abandons a culture or is withdrawn, you find it reverting right back to the savagery and darkness that was there before.
There's no doubt, Sam, that Christianity has been the greatest force for common good in the history of the world. That is, once again, not an opinion. That's just fact. I just happened to be just last week in Washington, D.C. and went to the Bible Museum, and right there on floor 2, I mean, it has all of the ways, and it's got proof right there, factual evidence of how it helped with human rights and science and technology and politics and sports and media and entertainment and government. I mean, just the list goes on of how the Christian worldview and ethics has shaped civilization. Os Guinness often says that the West would be unrecognizable if it wasn't for the Christian worldview spreading, not only as something that transforms the human soul, but also transforms society and nations.
There is no question about that. And I would say if you went back, there's a particularly pivotal time, and this is a theory of mine that I really love from my education that I got in my seminary, but the great conversation that comes along. In the West, it's pretty universally Catholic until you get to the Reformation. So you have these moral truths. You have the truths that come out of Aquinas and the great Catholic thinkers. But when you get to the Protestant Reformation, within 4 years of each other, you have two key figures. And I think they split. One is the city of man and one is the city of God. Machiavelli writes The Prince in 1513. And 4 years later, you have the Protestant Reformation. And Machiavelli introduced a political philosophy to the world that says, there's no real morality. The ends justify the means. Do whatever you can, do whatever you have to do to get what you want out of this. Because your kingdom is here. There's nothing beyond this world. So take it while you can. That's Machiavelli in a nutshell. 4 years later, you get Luther that spawns this idea of a universal priesthood of believers we're on a mission to bring heaven down to earth, to spread it all over the globe, to recapture, in a sense, this world for heavenly ethics and for the king who reigns on the throne. And so these two schools of thought then explode and they go in different directions. And during the Enlightenment, you have Christian thinkers that are doing unbelievable, wonderful things. But you also have guys like Rousseau and others that are coming out of that. Nietzsche, which is totally godless, that says, you know what, there's no real place for morality. There is no God. Might makes right. Take what you can. And what do you see that comes out of all the philosophers that chase after the godless city of man? What does Nietzsche give birth to? Nietzsche gives birth to, there's a super race. The might makes right. Who does that? Who loved Nietzsche? Hitler. And you see all these, the places where communism takes hold, where it's like this godless void and the state steps up and says, we'll make the utopia. There is no heaven. We'll bring heaven in our terms now because there's no God. All of the greatest suffering that's been brought into this world. It's not just that Christianity brings flourishing and beauty and health and life and all of those things when it's implemented. It's that the opposite, which is also a very distinct train of thought that comes out of that very same time period as the Reformation, has produced some of the most awful suffering, including the French Revolution. The most awful suffering comes from godless regimes that think they know better.
Yeah.
And think they can bring a utopia. And it always brings suffering.
And a fascinating case study is just to study the two revolutions, 1776, 1789. They were ultimately fighting for independence, fighting to launch this republic. Why did one fail royally, the French Revolution of 1789, and why are we still experiencing flourishing 250 years later here in America?
Yeah.
It's because there was something grounding. There was the leaven, as the founders would call it, the leaven of Christianity. That was the moral foundation for a flourishing society.
Yeah. When you go back and you look at the French Revolution, Robespierre, who leads that, if you read the founders, dozens of quotes that'll say that our republic and all of our liberties rest on the success of religion and morality. Go read their writings. They talk about it incessantly. Religion and morality, religion and morality, religion and morality.
Adam said the Constitution can't exist without morality and religion.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So Robespierre comes along and he says, well, no, it's about virtue, and he replaces religion with another word, and the word is terror. That's his writings. Yeah. So in other words, we're going to impose virtue by saying, if you disagree with us, you're going to the guillotine. Yep. And thousands of people did. And so what they did is they went around and they said, okay, we're taking all of the Catholic properties, all of their monasteries, all their churches, all their schools. We're going to rid the country of all this religious influence. We're going to change the calendar. Instead of a 7-day week, which comes from the Bible, we're going to do a 10-day week. We're going to change the annual calendar. We're going to force priests to denounce their faith, or otherwise they're going to be killed. They did all of these things thinking that the state would be wonderful to replace the church because the church was oppressive. And what happened? It was bloody revolution after revolution after revolution that ended up with them having a dictator named Napoleon over them. Sure. Because it turns out that people without religion need a strong arm to bring everybody in line. It's what our founders said, that if you don't have a force within to govern yourself,
there will be a tyrant.
You're going to need a force without to govern you. You're either governed by the Bible or the bayonet.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Let's go back to education. We talked about the influence of Christianity on education for the masses and the role that it played in the university system in Europe. But let's move to America. And we think of early institutions of higher education like Harvard. Explain to our audience, for those that don't know, the original purpose of Harvard, and how does the original purpose speak to the relationship between Christianity and higher education?
So when you look at the earliest laws that were passed in America, it's stunning. So if, for instance, the old Deluder Satan Act, which goes back to 1647, so a little bit after Harvard's founded, what is it that law says? Everybody needs to teach their children to write. Everybody has a responsibility to raise funds to make sure children can read. Why? Because they need to read the scriptures, to not fall into the folly of that old deluder Satan, and to know what salvation requires. You look at 1655, you have the New Haven Code, which is Connecticut area. And what is that? It's the same thing. Everybody needs to know how to read the scriptures so that they can find salvation, truth, and know how to live in God's world, because he's the designer. His word shows you how. But let's go to Harvard. Harvard's founded in 1636, and what a lot of people don't know is that it's founded by pastors. The stunning fact, 106 of the first 108 colleges in America were founded by Christian institutions. You know, one of the things I didn't know, I'm a UF grad. Did you know that UF was founded by church?
Had no idea.
I didn't either.
Yeah.
Did you know FSU?
Thought they were always pagans.
I was about to make the same joke about FSU. But they, too, were considered a religious founding.
That's amazing.
Stunning, right? Stunning. And so you go through Harvard. Listen to the list. And the founding statement was to train up a literate clergy. That's what Harvard's purpose is. Yeah. So imagine that against what exists today. And it's unrecognizable. So here's the first couple rules. The first rule required you to be able to translate the New Testament from Greek into English, right? It's like seminary grads can't do that today. Rule number 2, just listen to this. Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, and therefore to lay Christ in the bottom as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. Rule number 3, students have to read the scriptures twice a day and be prepared to offer reflections on their devotional time. Rule number 4, they couldn't use God's name in vain. The motto inside the original seal dating back to 1692 said truth for Christ and his church. So today Harvard is known, the motto Veritas, right? Truth. Yep. Well, they've gotten rid of where it originally started, which was truth for Christ and his church. Amazing. And that remained their logo till 1880, which is when everything blew up and started going crazy and turning against the church.
Yeah, it's phenomenal to just look at the history of these institutions of higher education. I remember seeing a stat, I don't know if it was 82% or 84%, but at the time of the Civil War, over 80% of the institutions of higher education in America were all founded by Christians.
Yeah.
It shows the importance and the influence that Christianity has had in educating, once again, not just Christians, but educating society, making a literate people, but all people understanding that the foundation of knowledge comes from the foundational truths of God's word.
And our founders absolutely prize that. So you'll see people that make the case that our founders wanted secularism, that they wanted God removed from everything, separation of church and state. Thomas Jefferson funded personally, like he directed this for the funding of Christian education for the Indians. So he said, I'm going to use taxpayer dollars to go out and fund education for the Native Americans that were beyond the borders, right? You have James Madison, who's the primary architect of the Constitution. President used to be the head of the school district for Washington, D.C. And so one of the things that Madison employed is, I want you to go out and to give report cards for all these schools. How are they doing? And one of the metrics that he wanted them to use, that we still have these report cards, by the way, was whether or not students knew how to read the Bible and how to read the Watts hymnal. So those were textbooks that were used under the authority of James Madison, the primary architect of the Constitution. You would find this all over the place, where the founders were buying Bibles to distribute and bringing in crates of Bibles to distribute. And the notion that they wanted religion purged from government is laughable. You don't find that anywhere. You find exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
And Harvard, by the way, just as a higher institution of learning, walk through them. Look, if you Google Yale's logo today, what you'll find is an open book with Hebrew words printed on the pages, which are Urim and Thummim, which are associated with how you find God's will in the Hebrew words. They were founded, quote, out of a zeal for upholding and propagating the Christian Protestant religion. They told their students that the main end of his study, to wit, was to know God and Jesus Christ. Like everything about their founding, and they were founded by 10 pastors. Princeton, which is now way off of its original founding. Listen to what this is. In Latin on their seal is the logo that says, "Under God's power, she flourishes." And again, you find an open book with Old and New Testament written on them. You find the same thing in University of Pennsylvania, where it's a stack of books on the logo. The top book, theology. Why? Because that is the highest thing you can devote your mind to.
I was just about to say that. Yeah, it was known at one point as the Queen of Sciences.
Yeah.
I remember looking at the curriculum or the syllabus for a law student at Yale in mandatory theology classes.
Absolutely.
For a law student, because they understood that you can't understand law without theology. It was the Queen of Sciences, once again showing the influence of Christianity on higher education. I think this conversation, let me just say as a sidebar, if you have a child that's going off to college, this is an important episode to watch, not only because Sam Kastensmidt is wicked smart, which you are, but they're about to go into a world where they're not only going to be mocked for their faith, particularly if they're going to a secular college campus, unfortunately some historically Christian colleges as well. But they're not only going to be mocked for their faith, but they are going to be indoctrinated with a lie that Christianity is oppressive, it's archaic, that it's backwards, and that it serves no earthly good. And we need Christian students that boldly are able to stand up and say, we wouldn't even be in this college setting. We wouldn't even be learning in institutions of higher education here in America if it was not for the Christian worldview and its influence.
Now, all of these institutions are borrowing the legacy of what the church has done for them. And the good news is, and this is really encouraging to me, is in the last 3 years, you look at study after study after study, what they're finding is that this younger generation is beginning to reject the poison that they've been fed for decades, right? So if you go back to the first time that religion starts being removed, or just even biblical literacy being removed from the United States, going back to Everson decision of the Supreme Court in 1947, which that's a whole story in and of itself.
Sure.
But then 62, where prayers removed, and 63, where Bible instructions removed, and the Ten Commandments are out in 1980, and you just see the systematic purging of any religious influence from education. And what has it resulted in? Because I'll tell you what it has not done. Like for the cynic and the skeptic out there that says, yeah, religion is just for weak-minded people, it's a crutch. Are we way smarter now that we have gotten rid of religion from our institutions? And the answer to that is definitively not. All of our academic performance and international competition has plummeted. Every category, math, science, reading, geography, you go down the list, and the results that we now produce as a nation are embarrassing. So have we gotten really, really smart? Absolutely not. So then the trade-off is, okay, well, at least our kids are much happier now that they're not chasing fairy tales in the sky or whatever. And the reality is, the answer to this. Like, this generation is crumbling under a crisis of mental and emotional health. The depression rates through the roof, anxiety rates, we've never seen them like this. Suicide rates, dangerous territory, record-breaking every decade. Like, why is this happening? It's like we've told kids, you have no purpose for living. You live in a world that is constantly upside down. We tell you that there's no purpose. We tell you that there's no hope. And then we send you off going, congratulations, go live a life. And they're like, for what?
Yeah.
And the truths that we're telling them to live by leave them empty and hopeless and meaningless.
And the irony is, and then the public is baffled with the rise of mental illness, the rise of suicide, the rise of mass school shootings. I go, what do you expect from a generation that's been taught and indoctrinated they are nothing more than a cosmic accident, no inherent dignity and value, no divine purpose? Of course, this is the fatal fruit of a generation that has been indoctrinated with a lie.
One of the interesting things when I started in Christian education was 2007 when I first went into the classroom and absolutely loved it. But the big popular voices, this is when the new atheism movement was in full swing. And you had Dawkins and Hitchens and those guys, Sam Harris, and they were talking about how Christianity is the worst thing that ever happened to humanity and, how it brought all this devastation. And I love now that their children, their ideological children have grown up. And now Europe is cratering. Europe is in deep trouble.
Yeah.
The United States is on a tipping point as to what we're going to be going into the future. But I
think England's lost.
Oh, yeah. They're in real trouble. Yeah. Real trouble. And that's where Dawkins now is like, count me as a Christian. Like, what?
At the very least, a cultural Christian.
Right. That's what he says. That's what he says.
I get the influence.
But 19 years ago, or let's see, 18 years ago when I got into the classroom, if you gave me a time machine to say that guy's going to be like, count me as a cultural Christian, I want Christianity to win. And the reason why he's saying that is he recognizes his own ideology of all the woke stuff, all the materialistic stuff. It is so empty. There's nothing worth fighting for. There's nothing worth living for. There's no backbone to stand against the oppression of Islam. Why would you? Yeah. Like, there's this life is meaningless. And so he's looking at his own ideological children that he's raised up going, well, they're certainly not the answer because it's dark and it's empty and it's meaningless and it's hopeless. And now Islam, this truly evil force, is just coming through there and decimating Europe and dominating England. He sees it coming and he knows that his stuff does not have the backbone to stand against that kind of oppression. And he's now rooting for Christianity. So think about that. One of the greatest atheistic philosophers of our day recognizes, at least ideologically, that Christianity is the best alternative in the world.
It's phenomenal.
So I don't want to hear anymore of this is a force for evil in the world. When your leading spokesman is like, please, I hope the Christians win.
Right.
Like, okay, you're cooked.
Yep.
You're cooked. So even if you're not, I'm glad he's a cultural Christian. I hope one day that he comes to genuinely believe that Christ is risen and reigning. But we need more people to start speaking up that we need the presence and the power of the Judeo-Christian ethics and the risen and reigning Lord that gives hope to everybody. Amen. That even in the darkest seasons, if you're a student out there that's listening and you're one of those people that's struggling with anxiety because you've been sold a false bill of goods that this world is all there is and there's nothing beyond it. No, there is a God who reigns in heaven, who has conquered death, who takes away all your shame and all your guilt, and he has paid the penalty for them to give you a hope and a future, and he rejoices over us. He sings over us. He empowers us by his Spirit to go into a world and to bring the flavor of heaven down to this earth. Like, your life has meaning and purpose, and this is exciting. We're on a mission. It's not this hopeless, empty, like, oh, got to wake up and deal with this suffering for no reason whatsoever. Like, that would drive me crazy
Absolutely.
too.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, and just that beautiful word and that invitation to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and be saved, because I do think it's important. And I think for our audience, we always need to, for those that enjoy conversations on Christian cultural engagement, as we talk on often on this podcast, and I know Sam talks often on his podcast as well. I think it was John Murray, the great theologian from Westminster Seminary, who said, the gospel, yes, transforms societies, but it's first and foremost for the individual. Mm-hmm. We do need to remember that the gospel transforms culture, society, wherever the Christian worldview goes, it transforms it. But the trouble many people got into in the early 1900s, for instance, in the whole social gospel, social justice movement, is they took the message of the supernatural transformation and regenerating power of the gospel for the individual, and they just focused on society. So thank you for bringing us clarity that this is not something that only changes nations, but it changes human hearts as well. And we have much reason to rejoice for that. Let's talk about the freedoms that we enjoy in America. I think a lot of people get confused regarding Christianity's role in the founding of this nation. I know you and I have talked offline about this. When we talk about the Christian influence in America, that we are not saying that every founder was a born-again evangelical believer. No. But what we are saying is that without a shadow of a doubt, it was the Christian worldview that played the primary role, that it was the foundational worldview that led to unprecedented freedom, unprecedented flourishing for now almost 250 years. Talk about the influence of Christianity on our founders, on our founding documents, and the constitutional republic that was established.
Yeah, I love this topic. There was a study that was done at the University of Houston where they looked at all of the communications. And I want to say they went from 1770 through 1805 of the writings of our founding generation. And what they found is the Bible, by far, was the number one cited source in their communications back and forth. And in fact, Deuteronomy was more than anyone else that came after them, like Locke and all the other philosophers. Like, the Bible was for sure the most referenced in putting all that together. But one of the things that I like, I use an acronym that I made when I teach called RAIL. And so it's like, keep the train on the tracks. Here's the tracks, ready? It's rail. So religious underpinnings of our liberties. The Declaration makes this crystal clear that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, right? Like the whole premise of liberty in our country is seen as these are things that come from God, right?
Transcendent.
And they're transcendent. They belong to you. No man gives them. No man can take them away. And so everything comes with the religious underpinnings are. So, and by the way, your duties and the design of the world and truth and everything else all comes there, which is absolutes. Like, we're not something that believes in the whims of culture where, hey, you know what, this could change tomorrow, and now this is right, and we're going over here and that's right. And when you got to Nuremberg and everybody was like, I was just under orders, what was the appeal? There is a higher law to which every man is accountable, and our founders understood that. Like, that's
self-evident truth.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they continually refer to the laws of nature and nature's God, which means there's a law out there that's fixed. It's the designer has written it into our existence. We see the consequences of getting away from it when you do. And by the way, it's not just the laws of nature as if this is impersonal. There's a God behind those laws, right? So we follow them, and you see that in their writings. You see it in the Declaration. So absolutes are a big deal. So religious underpinnings, absolutes. The next one is individual liberties, right? The I, R-A-I. So, and this one is, if you look at the Constitution, you have a right to property. You have a right to a voice. You have all of these things where prior to the Protestant Reformation, remember that universal priesthood of believers, where everybody you're given dignity. Like this, you have a relationship with God. You are royalty.
Yeah.
Like
before the Reformation, that didn't exist.
No way. You had, peasants and people
Caste
that were
system.
That's right. And so now all of a sudden everybody is inherently Imago Dei, everybody, right? Everybody's entitled to that. And that takes some working out in the American system, but we got there because of its influence, right? And so individual liberties, the mob can't come and say, we want your stuff, we think you have to do this. No. The individual is protected from the mob, which goes back to biblical principles all over the Old Testament and New Testament. And then the last one is limited government. So religious underpinnings, absolutes, individual rights, and limited government. Let's keep the train on the rail. And what that is like when you read the Constitution, there's so many of our young people that are not taught this. But the Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, comes and it says, this is not a document to give you rights. It's not. That's a document to secure your rights. It says that in the preamble. And then it goes about saying the government may not. It's not a list of what you're allowed to do. It's a list of what they're not allowed to do. The government may not take your right to free speech. It cannot make laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or impede the press, or right to assembly, or right to own weapons. So it goes through, and all of these things are recognizing something, that human nature is flawed. It's fallen. We're broken. Humanity cannot be trusted with power. That is expressly biblical. When you get to communism, think about the naivete and how radically this diverges from biblical wisdom, where they're like, you know what, we should gather up all the power and give it to somebody and trust them to be equitable toward everyone. Are you crazy? Humanity has never been capable of, a human being cannot be trusted with power. They will exploit it every time. King David will do it. Right? Anybody entrusted with absolute power is going to violate it. And our founders, who had thoroughly biblical worldviews, looked at humanity and says, oh my goodness.
They understood the doctrine of total depravity.
Yep. We're gonna make Congress a list of things they can't do. And oh, by the way, we're gonna have separation of powers over here because I don't want any of these branches to get out of control. We're gonna have routine elections. We're gonna have all these checks and balances. Why do they do that? Well, Madison tells us in the Federalist Papers, if men were angels, no governments would be necessary. But left unsaid, they're not. They're really wicked, self-absorbed creatures to themselves, and entrusted with power, they'll annihilate one another. And so our founders came with this really brilliant, beautiful thing, like we're going to entrust the individual, we're going to blanket it all with religious underpinnings, with absolutes, giving them their liberties and restraining the Leviathan, which was in the conversation back then from Hobbes. We're going to tie down the Leviathan, the government, as much as we can, and we're only going to let it loose to do the essential core functions, because we know if you release this thing to do too much, what's going to happen? Tyranny. And every other society, the French Revolution, the communist revolutions, where they're like, we're going to let the Leviathan loose. What does it end up doing? It devours the nation, and it devours the very people who let it go. Robespierre, leader of the French Revolution, guess where he ends up? In a guillotine. So you cannot trust the government with power, which is why, in the whole scheme of things, when you have a conversation with somebody about politics and they're on the other side, so let's say that they're on the left from me, it's weird to me that it's like they have such a distrust of government, and yet their answer to solve the problem is to empower the government to fix it. And it's like, no, it's the problem's not... It's not solely Democrat, Republican. The problem is humanity's fallen. All of us. We need to not empower them to do more than just as bare essential. So I'm a libertarian in that sense, not a pure libertarian, but I believe in those kinds of ethics. I don't want the government to have too much power, and neither does the Bible.
Sure. And our founders had a covenant with each other, as they had a covenant with God. I mean, where did that come from? This idea of covenant theology, the doctrine of covenant theology, the doctrine of total depravity, the doctrine of the inalienable rights that come from this idea that the state does not give us rights, but God does, is just such a beautiful reminder. And as you're talking, and you just make so many great points that we need to remember. But I'm thinking about the common phrase we often hear in politics these days, make America great again. but nobody's asking the question, what made it great in the first place? Before there was a Declaration of Independence, there was a Great Awakening in this nation. It was bold biblical teaching through the likes of Whitefield and Edwards and the Black Robe Regiment that came, later on, that really helped secure the ideals and the virtues that would lead to national flourishing that we're experiencing, sometimes barely, but still experiencing nearly 250 years later.
When you go back, you mentioned these people running around. One of the things that I love about Princeton's legacy is you look at the earliest presidents that they had, and these are the people who shaped the founders greatly. So John Witherspoon, who was a pastor, second longest serving president in Princeton's history, signed the Declaration.
And a Presbyterian.
Strong yep. Presbyterian, yes. Shout out. Yep. But he said this, "Accursed be all learning," just hear this, "Accursed be all learning which sets itself in opposition to the cross of Christ." Can you imagine anybody in higher education saying that today? And yet listen to the list of people that Princeton produced. This is on their website, by the way.
Yep.
People who studied under Reverend Witherspoon include President James Madison. Who's he? He's the primary architect of the Constitution. Vice President Aaron Burr, 9 cabinet officers, 21 United States senators. And remember, this is a time when there's not 50 states.
Yeah.
So to have 21 United States senators, 39 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, 3 justices of the Supreme Court, 12 governors, numerous delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Whoa.
Yeah.
And it's like you said, there was an understanding that we covenant together. Like this is going to cause some common suffering. When the Mayflower Compact, which is the first document, governing document signed in America, it begins with "In the name of God, amen." But what's the rest of it? It's we covenant together. We're going to do this together. It's going to cost us, but we're all in it together. That was the ethic that came out of the Reformation and authentic Christianity. On the other side, what were the leading voices on the other side that came from the track of Machiavelli and Rousseau and those guys, certainly Nietzsche later? All of that taught it's what's right for me. I'm going to do whatever means it takes to get the ends that I want. And so it trained people to exploit one another, where Christianity was like, no, I'll lay my life down for my friend.
So good.
That's the ethic we learned from our Savior. I will sacrifice for the good of the disadvantaged. I'll lay down my rights and privileges and wealth and status and everything else so that these people can be guaranteed a brighter tomorrow. That's beautiful.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time for this podcast, but I just want to make it very clear. In many ways, this is like tip of the iceberg stuff.
Oh.
We're just scratching the surface. So that means Sam is going to be back on the podcast. But I just hope this goes to show that if we're just scratching the surface, this shows the widespread influence of Christianity on the West. And I think it's such a timely apologetic for why we don't need less of this, right? We've bought a bill of lies, that secularism will answer all of the problems and challenges of society. We've bought that lie through the long marches through the institutions over the last 60 years. If anything, we need to embrace once again the leaven that made this country great in the first place, and understanding that without it, there is no human flourishing.
Amen. One of my favorite quotes comes from a Greek historian named Thucydides. And he says this, that history is philosophy teaching by example.
Yeah.
So stop and think on that for a moment. History is philosophy teaching by example. So whenever you have somebody who comes to you and says, this is what we should do, here's my philosophy, almost inevitably you can go back in history and be like, okay, how did that idea play out? Let's go back and find where that was tried before and see how it plays out. And you can do that with communistic ethics, materialistic ethics. You can do it with authentic Christianity. There's one that leads to flourishing, and the rest of them, we've seen how those philosophies result when they're played out in history. So let's learn from past mistakes and chart a course forward that's far more beautiful for everyone.
No doubt. Appreciate you so much, Sam. Sam, you have your own podcast. Share with our audience where they can find you.
We do. I have two podcasts that we're doing right now. They're both on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram. One of them is called Under the Hood, and it looks at like historical elements of biblical stories, archaeology, proofs, evidences, things like that. And the other one is called The Bible Show, same places. And that one walks through stories of the Bible. So like right now we're walking through a story, the story of Genesis, and we're in the life of Abraham. It's a lot of fun. So I invite your listeners to check it out.
Love it. Sam, appreciate your friendship and partnership in the gospel.
Back at you.
And that's all the time we have for the City of God podcast. If you enjoyed or were encouraged by this episode with Sam Kastensmidt, I don't know how you could not be inspired and enjoy this conversation on the influence of Christianity on Western civilization. I pray that you would pass it along to a family member, a friend, anyone who's interested in the intersection of faith and culture. Thank you once again for joining us, and we'll see you right back here next time on the City of God. The City of God podcast is produced by Coral Ridge Ministries and made in partnership with the Institute for Faith and Culture. Visit us at cityofgodpodcast.com to access all of our previous episodes. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or anywhere you get podcasts. A full video version of this podcast is available on YouTube. This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture.